the last panel for today, and we're going to try to connect. Everybody will speak to the microphone because it's difficult to hear back there in the back. So ours is the most kind of nitty-gritty legal detail panel of the day. We're trying to connect the discussions that took place in both the two earlier panels and talk about specifically what are the loopholes and the impediments, legally speaking, in Israeli law dealing with activism and engaging with companies under Israeli law, and we'll try to have a kind of a comparative view, and Michal is going to help us with this, between Israel and the United States. So what I'm gonna I'll start this discussion by saying that the Israeli Companies Law of 1999 is a kind of an interesting creature. After teaching several years in the United States, I came back. I made Aliyah, so to speak, after spending some time in the US, and discovered that the law that I have to teach here to my students is somewhat different from what I was used to in under Delaware law. Israeli law seems to be very pro-shareholder and affords public shareholders rights that they wouldn't have under Delaware law, and we're going to talk about it in a minute. For example, Israeli shareholders can demand a special shareholder meeting. They don't have to wait for the annual shareholder meeting as they have to in the United States. Now, it's true that under Delaware law, the default rule is that shareholders can also act by written consent, but then most charters opt out of this, and so as a practical matter, shareholders have to wait. And then, of course, Israel also has a special provision, in fact, a set of provisions that grant minority shareholders special veto rights on a number of key decisions for the firm. Asaf alluded to this earlier. First, the Israeli shareholders have the right to veto the appointment of two mandatory outside directors that have to be on a public company's board. Their appointment has to be approved. Used to be by a third of the minority shareholders. Nowadays it's by a majority of the minority shareholders, and not only that, Israeli law allows the minority shareholders to put forward the names of those two directors for reappointment over the objection of the controlling shareholders. So for the initial appointment, you need basically joint consent of both the controlling shareholder and the minority shareholders on the names, but for later, for the additional terms, they are appointed for 3-year terms, up to 3 times in a row. And for the 2 second terms, the shareholders, in theory, can insist on those directors staying in office. So that's an additional element of Israeli law. And then, of course, related party transactions in Israel, and that includes also compensation paid to controlling shareholders and relatives of controlling shareholders if they happen to be executives. They too have to be approved by a majority of the minority shareholders, unlike Delaware, where related party transactions not necessarily get this kind of approval. Companies can choose to subject a certain, say, freeze-out merger to minority shareholder approval. It's not mandatory. In Israel it is. So all those rights give minority shareholders some power, and in some respects, I think the reason why the shareholders in Israel have so many rights is that originally the law was not designed for companies with widely held companies. So, for example, in an Israeli company, you can you can demand a special shareholder meeting, but you can't really do much in that meeting if you don't have the majority. If there is a controlling shareholder, it doesn't really matter. Things change in recent years because shareholders are using their veto rights, especially with respect to the election of directors, those two outside directors, and that can empower them in a way that probably doesn't exist in the United States. So with that, I will ask our panelists to talk about various aspects of this. I'll start with Udi Sol from Herzog Fox Neyman, who's today, instead of Ilanit, she didn't feel well today, and so Udi graciously agreed to take the lead there. I'd like to ask you about if you can separate between companies with controlling shareholders and companies without controlling shareholders under Israeli law. Where do you see that Israeli law gives activists or shareholder activism a lot of opportunity, a lot of maneuvering room?